Ilhan Omar came to America at 12 years old, carrying a plastic bag filled with clothes and no money in her pocket. A refugee from a civil war that most Americans could not find on a map. A girl whose story would later be packaged as proof that the American promise still worked if you believed hard enough and spoke loudly enough. 20 years later, that same girl's federal financial disclosures listed assets worth tens of millions of dollars. A jump so dramatic that it did not read like the American dream, but like an accounting error with a pulse. A company connected to her household went from a valuation hovering around $250,000 to somewhere between $5 and $25 million in a single year. A growth curve that does not happen in silence and does not happen by accident. A California winery appeared on the disclosures as if it had always been there, valued in the millions, while the community she represented had just absorbed a $250 million fraud scandal, the largest pandemic fraud case in American history. For years, no one publicly connected those two trajectories, the exploding valuations and the collapsing daycare system, until the day a man who had grown up counting pennies at a kitchen table decided he was done pretending not to see the math. That man was J.D. Vance, the kid from Middletown, Ohio, the son of a heroin-addicted mother who could not stay sober long enough to pick him up from school. The Marine who went to Iraq before he went to Yale, the author who turned Appalachian Collapse into a national bestseller, and eventually the Vice President of the United States. He knew something about poverty that does not show up in campaign speeches, the kind that smells like stale smoke and unpaid electric bills. The kind that forces children to grow up faster than they should, because adults around them refuse to. He also knew something about fraud, not from textbooks, but from neighborhoods where disability checks arrived for backs that worked just fine, and where government programs meant for the desperate were treated like side hustles. He understood that when a system collapses under the weight of lies, the people who suffer first are not politicians, but small business owners, single mothers, and children whose names never appear in press releases. So when he took his seat in the Russell Senate office building that morning, he was not walking into a television segment. He was walking into a reckoning. The Russell Building does not flatter anyone. Its marble floors are worn by decades of footsteps from senators who once believed they were untouchable and later discovered that history has a longer memory than ambition. The ceilings rise high not to inspire, but to remind, a quiet architectural warning that you are small inside institutions built before you were born, and that will outlast your career. McCarthy sat in those halls, convinced he could hunt ghosts forever, until the cameras turned and the country saw him clearly. Watergate unraveled there, not because the powerful volunteered honesty, but because questions kept coming long after the rehearsed answers ran out. Room 325 filled before most staffers had finished their coffee. Press lined the back wall. National networks, wire services, foreign correspondents who had learned that American political implosions often have global consequences. Staffers stood shoulder to shoulder, tablets glowing, legal pads ready, whispering predictions about how the morning would unfold. In the front row sat three people who had never asked to be part of a national story and who would rather have stayed anonymous, but whose lives had already been reshaped by numbers that did not add up. They did not look like political props, because they were not. They looked like people bracing for something they did not fully understand, but knew would matter. Vance entered at 8:55 without a tie, navy suit, sleeves straight, expression unreadable. He did not work the room, did not shake extra hands for cameras, did not smile in the way politicians smile when they are about to perform outrage. He took the chairman's seat at the center of the raised dais flanked by Dr. Mehmet Oz from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and a forensic accountant from the Government Accountability Office whose face suggested he trusted spreadsheets more than speeches. Behind Vance, two screens waited dark, silent, ready. In front of him, three binders rested like sealed indictments. Ilhan Omar arrived 7 minutes later with staffers and a lawyer whose hourly rate exceeded what many of her constituents made in a week. She wore a maroon hijab and a black blazer, posture straight, jaw set, the body language of someone who had already decided that the battle was unfair and that she would say so before anyone else could define it. She did not wait for ceremony, did not wait for introductions, did not wait for the rhythm of the room to settle. She adjusted her microphone and fired first, calling the hearing a political hit job before a single question had been asked. Her voice carried the practiced heat of someone who had built a career on moral fury, who understood that if you frame the story fast enough, you can force your opponent to fight on your terrain. She spoke of Islamophobia, of persecution, of Minnesota being punished for voting Democrat, of an administration freezing Medicaid funds that paid for children's therapy and elderly care. She spoke not to Vance, but to the cameras, because cameras are where reputations are defended and narratives are preserved. She described herself as a survivor of civil war, of refugee camps, of political attacks, and she promised she would survive this too. Her lawyer nodded, her staffers nodded. The choreography precise and familiar. It was a strategy that had worked for years. Attack first, force your critics to appear cruel, frame accountability as discrimination. Vance let her finish without interruption. He did not smirk, did not roll his eyes, did not lean into the microphone to cut her off. He looked tired, not theatrically, but genuinely. The kind of fatigue that comes from flying to Minneapolis the day before, spending hours in a community center listening to people describe what had been taken from them, and then returning to Washington to sit under bright lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and flat, not angry, but immovable. He asked her if she was finished, because 70 Minnesota families wanted to know where their money had gone, and he believed their questions outweighed her opening speech. The shift in the room was subtle but immediate. This was no longer a cable news segment built for applause lines. It was something heavier, something slower. Vance said the hearing was not about her, that it had never been about her, and that before another word about persecution was spoken, he wanted America to meet three people. He did not open the first binder right away. He looked instead at the front row, at the woman sitting there with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Her name was Haile Lima Muhammad. She had opened a daycare in Cedar Riverside in 2018 with 12 children and a state subsidy of $700 a month, waking at 5 every morning to cook breakfast and teach ABCs in English and Somali. She was not a headline, not a symbol, just a small business owner who believed that if she worked hard enough, the system would leave her alone. When the fraud in Hennepin County exploded, investigators shut down dozens of daycares, including hers, not because she had stolen anything, but because the scale of theft made it impossible to distinguish honest from dishonest overnight. Her license vanished, her income vanished, and the 12 children who relied on her were scattered. Vance did not dramatize her story. He recited it the way someone reads a ledger, calm, precise, letting the facts carry their own weight. He said she now worked as a cashier at Target, that she had gone from running her own business to scanning barcodes because criminals in her community had siphoned off hundreds of millions and left everyone under suspicion. He looked at Omar and said Haile Lima had voted for her 3 times. He asked where she had been when the fraud was obvious and growing, when honest businesses were being swallowed by investigations triggered by thieves. Omar leaned forward and insisted she had spoken out against fraud and called for accountability. Vance asked for a date, a tweet, a press conference, a single moment where she stood before her community and declared the fraud unacceptable. The silence that followed did not need commentary. 4 seconds in a Senate hearing room stretch like an accusation, especially when cameras are rolling and no answer arrives. He closed the binder gently and said he did not think she could provide that example. The first crack in the performance had appeared. The building that had watched empires of ego collapse before was listening again. He did not let the silence linger long enough to soften. He turned his head slightly toward the young woman seated beside Hale Lima, the one holding a small girl whose shoes did not quite touch the floor. Her name was Fatima Abdi, and the child in her lap was Amina, 6 years old, diagnosed on the autism spectrum, a child whose progress depended on routine and repetition more than rhetoric. Medicaid covered her speech therapy 3 times a week, the structured sessions that slowly helped her form sounds into words, words into sentences, sentences into connection. When the funding was temporarily frozen for audit after $250 million disappeared into shell accounts and phantom childcare centers, those sessions stopped, and time for a child like Amina is not theoretical. It is developmental. Vance described the phone calls without embellishment. Fatima called her congresswoman's office once and reached voicemail, called again and reached voicemail, called a 3rd time, and finally spoke to a staffer who said they were monitoring the situation. Monitoring the situation is what you say when the crisis is abstract, when the damage is measured in charts, not in a child forgetting a word she had finally learned to pronounce. 3 weeks without therapy for Amina meant regression, and regression at 6 years old can cost months of recovery, sometimes more. Vance repeated the phrase monitoring the situation as if testing it for weight, as if asking whether it was heavy enough to carry a child's lost progress. He looked at Omar when he said that his office had called CMS the previous day. He said Amina's therapy would resume Monday, because sometimes it takes a vice president to do what a member of Congress could have done with a single phone call. He did not raise his voice when he said it, and that restraint carried more force than anger would have. He told Omar that she had gone on television and called the audit cruel, that she had framed the funding freeze as punishment, instead of a necessary review after the largest pandemic fraud case in American history erupted in her district. He said she cried on CNN about her community being targeted, but did not cry for a 6-year-old losing speech therapy. The room tightened again, not in outrage, but in recognition. Reporters who had arrived expecting a partisan brawl found themselves writing down details about daycare closures and therapy interruptions instead of sound bites about persecution. The forensic accountant beside Vance remained still, hands folded, but his presence alone underscored that this was not theater. It was arithmetic. Fatima did not look at Omar, and that absence of eye contact was more damaging than any cross-examination. Amina stared at the ceiling lights, unaware that her name had just become a national reference point. Vance moved to the 3rd story without theatrics. Ahmed Farah had operated a licensed daycare for 20 children, inspected, compliant, audited without incident for years. When investigators descended on Hennepin County, his center was shut down for 6 months, along with dozens of others, because the fraud was so systemic that the state no longer trusted its own records. When he was cleared, fully cleared, his clients were gone. Parents had relocated their children, and reputations once stained do not return to pristine condition overnight. He now drove for Uber, a small business owner reduced to chasing surge pricing because criminals in his orbit had poisoned the well for everyone. Vance did not accuse Omar of committing the fraud. He accused her of failing to confront it with the urgency it demanded. He said 70 people had been charged, that $250 million had vanished, that it was the largest pandemic fraud case in American history, and that it unfolded under her watch in her district. He said Ahmed did not need tweets about Palestine or viral clips condemning federal agencies. He needed protection from criminals exploiting a system designed to help children. He said leadership is not measured by how often you appear on cable news, but by whether the honest people in your community can survive the criminals operating beside them. Omar tried to reclaim the narrative. She insisted she had been in Cedar Riverside every week for 7 years, that she knew these families before their names were placed in binders, that Vance was exploiting their pain for political gain. She turned toward the front row as if expecting affirmation, the familiar nod of solidarity that had carried her through countless town halls. Haley Lima stared at her own hands. Fatima adjusted her daughter's collar and kept her eyes down. Ahmed did not blink. He looked straight ahead at the wall behind the dais, as if focusing on a point beyond the room, beyond the moment. For a brief second, the air in room 325 changed in a way no microphone could capture, because the congresswoman who had long claimed the moral center of her district found herself unable to draw visible support from the 3 people whose stories now defined the hearing. Cameras captured the glance, the pause, the unreturned gaze, and that footage would replay all afternoon on screens across the country. But in the room, it was quieter than television would ever convey. Vance did not comment on the silence. He let it stand as its own testimony. Then he said plainly that if her office had returned Fatima's calls, he would not have needed to. He said that if she had stood in front of her district and declared the fraud intolerable, the audit might not have required such blunt instruments. He reached for the second binder, and the tone of the hearing shifted from personal stories to public disclosures. The screen behind him lit up with 2 columns of numbers. On the left, financial disclosures from the prior year listing Rose Lake Capital between $100,000 and $250,000. On the right, disclosures from the following year, listing the same entity between $5 million and $25 million. In 12 months, the valuation had multiplied somewhere between 20 and 250 times, a jump that does not hide quietly in footnotes. A California winery appeared on the same disclosures, valued between $1 and $5 million, an addition that raised more questions than it answered. Omar's lawyer leaned forward and objected to speculation. Vance said these were public records, numbers she herself had reported, ranges permitted under federal law, but still indicative of dramatic change. He said President Trump had cited a $44 million net worth figure, and that if it was wrong, she could open the books and correct the record live on air. He said he would apologize publicly if the numbers were misleading. He said math is not an ideology, and it does not respond to accusations of bias. Omar said the valuations reflected company estimates, not personal income. She said her husband's income from the firm did not exceed $15,000. Vance paused and let that statement hang, then said that a share in a company valued at $25 million yielding $15,000 in income strains credulity. He said he grew up poor, but he did not grow up stupid, and the phrase landed not as an insult, but as a verdict, delivered by someone who had earned the right to speak about poverty without romanticizing it. The gallery did not laugh, because the moment was not comedic, it was clarifying. The forensic accountant cleared his throat and spoke in clinical terms. He described the rate of increase as statistically anomalous, language that in accounting circles signals a need for scrutiny. Vance translated it into plain English, saying it does not happen in normal business without extraordinary events, and no extraordinary explanation had been offered. He said He was not calling her guilty, he was calling her silent. In that building, silence after a direct question reads like consent to suspicion. Omar pivoted to familiar terrain. She called it a pattern of targeting a black Muslim woman who had succeeded in America. She framed the inquiry as an attack born of prejudice, not principle. Vance responded that Hale Lima, Fatima, and Ahmed were Muslim too, and they were not under investigation. They were casualties of fraud. He said a shield aimed in the wrong direction does not protect the innocent. It protects the narrative. When she blamed the investigation on President Trump, he reminded her it began under President Biden's Department of Justice. The contradiction surfaced in real time, and the room felt it. Her lawyer scribbled notes, slid them toward her, and she pushed them aside. The microphones picked up the faint sound of her bracelet striking the table. Vance closed the binder slowly, as if marking the end of one phase and preparing for something heavier. The shift toward character was not announced, but it was unmistakable. He said he wanted to address something beyond money, beyond audits, beyond valuations. He mentioned September 10, 2025, and the name Charlie Kirk. He described a 31-year-old father of two shot on a college campus, a man whose politics were polarizing, but whose death was not a metaphor. He said that within days, Omar had shared a video implying that Kirk bore responsibility for his own murder. Omar's hands moved again, restless now. She said she had condemned violence. Vance said condemning violence, while amplifying rhetoric that frames the victim as a monster, is not contradiction. It is strategy. He said when she received death threats, he condemned them unequivocally. He said when Charlie Kirk was killed, she shared a clip that called him Frankenstein. The room did not erupt. It absorbed the accusation the way old marble absorbs echoes. Vance spoke about being a father, about imagining his own children watching footage of a member of Congress mocking their murdered parent. He did not shout. He slowed down, and the slowing carried more weight than volume ever could. Omar stood briefly, then sat again, anger and calculation competing across her face. Her lawyer requested a recess. Vance refused, noting she had chosen to attend without compulsion and could endure 15 more minutes. The power dynamic had shifted from rhetoric to resolve. Room 325 felt smaller now, not because the walls moved, but because the space between answers and consequences had narrowed. The air in the room did not break when the recess was denied. It thickened. There is a particular weight that settles over a hearing when everyone understands that the point of no return has already been crossed, and whatever comes next will not be softened by courtesy. Omar remained seated, back straight, chin lifted, but the rhythm she had relied on for 7 years was gone. The cadence of indignation had been replaced by something more dangerous. A narrowing corridor where each word would either restore control or accelerate loss. Vance did not rush. He gathered the binders and moved them aside as if to signal that documents were no longer necessary. What he was about to say did not require spreadsheets or projections. It required memory. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, eyes level with Omar's. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. This was no longer about fraud alone. It was about judgment. He returned to Charlie Kirk. He described the campus, the chaos, the first responders, the 2 children left without a father. He did not defend Kirk's politics, did not rehearse talking points about ideology or speech. He focused on the fact of death. He said that within 48 hours of a family planning a funeral, a sitting member of Congress had amplified a video suggesting that the murdered man had created his own monster. Omar said again that she had condemned violence. Vance acknowledged that she had, and then he repeated that she had also reposted content calling the victim Frankenstein. He said condemning violence in one sentence while celebrating it in another is not nuance, it is calculation. He said most politicians understand the double message, speak softly for the press, shout for the base. He said few are reckless enough to apply that formula to a fresh grave. The cameras did not move. The red lights on their lenses remained steady, fixed on Omar's face. Her jaw tightened and she rose again, voice raised now, speaking of daily death threats she received, of rhetoric from President Trump that she said put her in danger. Vance did not interrupt. When she finished, he said plainly that no one deserves to be threatened. Not her, not her family, not anyone. He let that sincerity settle. Then he said the difference between them was simple. When she was threatened, he condemned it without qualification. When Charlie Kirk was murdered, she shared content that framed his death as poetic justice. That difference, he said, is not partisan. It is moral. Her lawyer slid another note across the table. 5 words written in block letters. Invoke counsel. Say nothing more. She read it and did not follow it. She said she had served her community for 7 years. Vance replied that serving a community requires telling it the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. He shifted to his own story without warning. He said she had opened the hearing with her biography, and he would do the same. He spoke of Middletown, Ohio, of a mother addicted to heroin, of a grandmother who clipped coupons and counted cigarettes and insisted on 2 rules. Do not lie, and do not abandon people who need you. He described riding in a car while his mother was high, the fear of a child who understands something is wrong, but cannot fix it. He said he joined the Marines not because it was glamorous, but because discipline felt like oxygen after chaos. He went to Iraq and returned, went to Ohio State, and then Yale Law School, a path that sounds linear when recited, but was anything but smooth. He said he wrote Hillbilly Elegy not to excuse his community's failures, but to confront them. He did not blame anti-Appalachian bias for opioid addiction. He did not blame distant conspiracies for domestic collapse. He said he told the truth about his own backyard. He said he wrote about dysfunction and decay and cultural surrender because pretending otherwise would have been easier but dishonest. He said that when you love a place, you do not romanticize its wounds. You clean them. Then he looked at Omar and said her district was bleeding. 70 people charged, $250 million stolen, daycare centers shuttered, Medicaid funding frozen. He said the choice before her had been clear. Stand before her community and say, we have a problem. We will fix it. Or stand before cameras and say, do not look at us. This is prejudice. He said she chose the second path repeatedly. When she described September 11th as, some people did something, she minimized a national trauma in a way that alienated those who lost family members. When she tweeted about hypnotized lawmakers and all about the Benjamins, she invoked tropes that she later partially apologized for. He did not linger on those episodes as partisan attacks. He presented them as patterns. Each time controversy erupted, each time an opportunity to recalibrate appeared, she chose the explanation that placed blame outside herself. He said, that is not leadership. He said, that is performance. He leaned back slightly and quoted his grandmother again. 2 kinds of people, she had told him, those who fix problems and those who blame others. He said he had spent his life trying to be the first kind. He said Congresswoman Omar had made a career of being the second. The words did not explode. They settled. There was no applause, no gasps, just a collective stillness that felt closer to a jury deliberation than a political hearing. Several senators avoided eye contact with Omar. Staffers stared at their notes as if they might offer an escape hatch. The press in the back row typed faster. Omar's face was controlled but pale. She began to repeat that she had served faithfully, that she had fought for her district. Vance interrupted quietly and said Hala Lima did not think so. He said Fatima did not think so. He said Ahmed did not think so. He said after today, many others might not think so either. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He stated it as a forecast. He gathered the binders and stacked them neatly. He said the hearing had been scheduled for 2 hours and had exceeded that. He thanked her for attending. He adjourned the session. The gavel fell without drama. But outside the room, the rupture had already begun. Clips moved across social media in waves. The first viral moment was simple and surgical. I grew up poor. I did not grow up stupid. It spread because it did not sound scripted. It sounded like something said at a kitchen table. 31 million views by midnight. Memes appeared within hours. The second wave centered on "You cried for the cameras." 26 million views. Cable segments looped the exchange. Commentators who had expected partisan noise found themselves replaying footage of a congresswoman unable to secure eye contact from her own constituents. The third wave took longer to crest. You are the second kind. It resonated differently. Not as insult, but as classification. Conservative outlets framed it as a defining moment. Fox News ran the Kirk exchange in full. Sean Hannity stared at the camera after the clip ended and predicted presidential ambitions. Laura Ingraham replayed Hala Lima's story and asked how a district could tolerate such negligence. Even mainstream networks acknowledged the impact. CNN's Kieran read Vance grills Omar on Minnesota fraud. MSNBC, cautious but unable to ignore the optics, conceded that the daycare stories undercut the Islamophobia defense. Political panels debated whether she should have opened her financial records more aggressively. President Trump posted within hours, praising Vance and calling for further investigation. The Department of Justice released a brief statement that it continued reviewing materials related to financial disclosures. The House Ethics Committee announced it would examine information raised during the hearing. The machinery of Washington began to move, not loudly, but steadily. The Democratic leadership response was conspicuously restrained. No immediate defense from party leadership. No coordinated messaging blast. Sources whispered that she had been advised not to attend the hearing at all. Progressive allies offered silence instead of solidarity. One unnamed member reportedly said she should have opened the books and moved on. The absence of defense spoke louder than any condemnation. In politics, abandonment rarely announces itself. Omar's office released a 3-sentence statement late in the afternoon. She had cooperated fully. She remained focused on serving Minnesota's 5th district. She had no further comment. The ratio on social media told its own story. Her flight back to Minneapolis was not commercial. She sat alone on a charter, phone dark. Staff drafting statements she would not approve. The television at home later carried her own name in endless repetition. Back in Cedar Riverside, women gathered in Hala Lima's apartment. Tea steamed on the stove. A phone screen replayed the clip where the vice president spoke her name into the Senate record. "He knew your name," one woman said quietly. Hala Lima did not smile. She said he had come the day before and stayed 45 minutes. The oldest woman in the room, who had voted for Omar every cycle, set down her cup. "Maybe we need someone else," she said. No one argued. No one agreed out loud. But the thought once spoken, did not leave the room. By the time the Quinnipiac poll dropped 72 hours later, the damage was no longer theoretical. Numbers do not lie out of emotion. They record shifts the way seismographs record tremors before buildings fall. Her favorability in her own district had dropped 9 points in 3 days. And among Somali American voters in Hennepin County, the foundation of her political identity, approval had fallen from 71% to 54%. 17 points in 72 hours is not a fluctuation. It is a fracture line opening under pressure. Still a majority, technically, but no longer invincible. Cable networks parsed the polling as if it were weather data. Analysts circled the Somali American subset with digital markers and spoke in cautious tones about erosion within core constituencies. They replayed the moment in room 325 when she sought eye contact and found none, slowing the footage to emphasize the absence of affirmation. They contrasted her rhetorical confidence at the start of the hearing with the stillness at the end, freeze-framing the scratch in the wood she stared at while the gavel fell. The narrative had shifted from persecution to vulnerability, and that shift is difficult to reverse once it takes root. In Washington, senior Democrats held closed-door conversations that did not include her. The calculus was brutal but familiar. Protect the seat or protect the brand. Some argued that the district was safely blue, and any Republican challenge was a fantasy. Others pointed to the poll and said primary challenges do not require Republican victories. They require dissatisfaction. Nobody volunteered to defend her performance publicly. The Progressive Caucus, once quick to rally around her during controversies, offered carefully worded silence. No tweets condemning the hearing as a witch hunt. No coordinated Instagram stories about systemic bias. A single unnamed aide told a reporter that the optics had been avoidable, that opening financial records decisively might have blunted the attack. Omar's communications director drafted a strategy memo outlining 3 options. Lean into the persecution narrative and mobilize the base. Release additional financial documentation in controlled fashion. Shift focus to legislative wins and hope the news cycle moves on. She rejected the first as redundant, the second as risky, and the third as naive. The problem was not a single headline, but a convergence of themes that now linked fraud, financial disclosures, and moral judgment. Her husband Tim suggested she avoid cable news for a week. She agreed, which in itself marked a departure from instinct. Meanwhile, on Air Force 2, Vance's staff reviewed call logs. He had instructed them to follow up with the Minnesota Department of Human Services about expedited relicensing for Hale Lima. He asked whether Ahmed's daycare status could be publicly clarified to help rebuild trust with parents. He requested confirmation from CMS that Amina's therapy had resumed as scheduled. The deputy chief of staff showed him clip counts climbing in real time. 31 million views for the poverty line. 26 million for the camera's comment. The grandmother, quote, trending in unlikely circles, teachers' groups, veterans' forums, small business associations. Vance did not dwell on the numbers. He turned to an Iran briefing book because the office he occupied does not allow indulgence in yesterday's victory. But before closing the laptop, he asked one more question. Did anyone from Omar's office reach out to Fatima after the hearing? The answer was no. He nodded once and looked out the window at clouds that did not care about Washington drama. He had learned early that outrage fades, but follow-through builds memory. If his office could solve one tangible problem in Cedar Riverside, the narrative would not be abstract. It would be embodied. Back in Minneapolis, the Somali women who gathered in Hale Lima's apartment did not speak in polling percentages. They spoke in lived reality. One woman said her nephew's daycare had closed during the audit and never reopened. Another said she had defended Omar at every community meeting for years, but this time she felt uneasy. Haley Lima replayed the clip where Vance said her name. Not because it flattered her, but because it acknowledged her existence. For years, she had felt like a statistic in larger debates about immigration and social programs. In that hearing, she had been a person. The oldest woman in the room, the one with Omar's campaign photo still on her refrigerator, spoke again. She said, "Loyalty is earned daily, not stored indefinitely." She said defending someone out of habit is not the same as believing they are defending you. The others listened without interrupting. At Omar's home, the television volume remained low but constant. Tim switched channels from Fox to CNN to MSNBC, searching for sympathetic framing. He found nuance, but not rescue. Panels acknowledged that while attacks may have political motivation, the daycare stories were real. Omar lay awake that night longer than she admitted. She replayed the hearing in her mind, searching for a pivot she had missed, a phrase she should have chosen differently. The silence from Haley Lima echoed louder than any accusation. She told herself that outrage cycles pass. But she knew something else too. The district she represented had matured. It was no longer content with symbolic representation alone. It wanted protection from chaos. Within a week, a local Minnesota radio host invited Haley Lima to speak. She declined at first, wary of becoming ammunition. But after encouragement from neighbors, she agreed to a short segment. She spoke softly, said she respected the Congresswoman, but wished someone had acted sooner against fraud. The clip circulated locally before going national. It was not explosive. It was calm, and calm disappointment often carries more credibility than fury. Democratic strategists monitored the district quietly. Potential primary challengers assessed whether this moment signaled weakness. No one announced a campaign, but exploratory conversations began. Money, as always, followed uncertainty. Omar held a closed-door meeting with select community leaders. She apologized for any communication gaps during the audit. She defended her broader record on housing and education. She promised increased transparency. Some left reassured, others left unconvinced. The fracture had not widened dramatically, but it had been revealed. In Washington, the Ethics Committee's inquiry remained preliminary. The DOJ statement did not escalate, but did not retreat. The financial disclosure question lingered like humidity before a storm. Nothing definitive, but nothing resolved. Vance returned to routine governance, foreign policy briefings, budget negotiations, a public appearance in Ohio where he did not mention Omar by name. Reporters asked whether he regretted the severity of his words. He said accountability is not cruelty. He said if leadership means anything, it means confronting uncomfortable truths. Then he pivoted to infrastructure funding and left the stage. In Cedar Riverside, conversations continued in kitchens and mosques. Not loud debates, but quiet recalibrations. Some argued the hearing was political theater. Others said theater does not close real daycares. Amina resumed speech therapy. Fatima noticed small improvements returning. She did not speak publicly, but told friends she appreciated the intervention, regardless of politics. Ahmed continued driving for Uber, while considering whether reopening a daycare was worth the risk. Weeks passed. The media cycle shifted to other crises. But the memory of that morning in room 325 did not vanish entirely. It lingered as a reference point whenever accountability was discussed. Omar remained in office. Her base did not evaporate. But the certainty that once surrounded her felt thinner. The assumption of automatic solidarity had been challenged. The Russell Building returned to its ordinary rhythm of hearings and speeches. Marble does not memorialize every confrontation, but occasionally, a moment embeds itself in institutional memory, not because of volume, but because of clarity. In Hale Lima's apartment, the campaign photo on the refrigerator stayed up for a time. Then one afternoon, without announcement, it was removed to make space for a child's drawing. No declaration accompanied the change, just a quiet rearrangement of priorities. The thought that had surfaced that night did not disappear. Maybe we need someone else. It was not shouted. It was considered. And in politics, consideration is the first step toward change.